Before I proceed with today's video, may I first of all take this opportunity to apologise for the very late publication of yesterday's video. It was in fact only published early this morning. The reason for that, I'm afraid, is that it ran into all kinds of technical problems and issues of uploading and downloading yesterday, which took hours to sort out, and that, I'm afraid, is the reason that the video was published so late. I'm sorry, I apologise. Sometimes these things happen, and I will now move on to discuss the various topics of today. And coming to today, I am starting to see commentaries appearing in various publications all at once, which, to some extent at least, appear to echo points that we've been making on the Duran ever since this latest stage in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict began, and which also echo many of the comments that I've been making, observations I've been making on this channel. Specifically, I have said that the decision by Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government to seek a military solution to the problem of Hamas and a military response to the events of 7th October, the day when Hamas launched its violent attack on southern Israel, which resulted in hostages being taken, large numbers of civilians being killed, devastation, overrunning of military bases, that kind of thing. Anyway, I said that the decision of Prime Minister Netanyahu and of the Israeli government to respond to those events in a purely military way, and President Biden's decision to support Prime Minister Netanyahu's decision to approach the response to the events of 7th October in a military way was politically extremely risky. I said that it would result in huge numbers of civilian casualties, and I said that it might be militarily risky as well, though as a non-military person, the last point of those three is one about which I am most tentative. I said that the political risks of this operation would increase given the undoubted massive civilian casualties that this operation would cause, that the political risks would grow, that a time would come when the backlash against this operation would become overwhelming, and I said that it seemed to me that this operation would undoubtedly, unquestionably be time limited. It would not be possible to maintain it, to sustain it indefinitely. I said that attempting to do so would provoke a political backlash within the United States and in Western countries, within Western countries, and that it would also unite much of the global community against the United States, Israel, and the Western powers, and that it would lead to a further loss of global support for the United States and for the Western powers in this duel that the Western powers and the United States have become involved in against the United States, against China, and the BRICS countries. Well, as I said today, we've had a string of articles which make some, though not all, of the same points. None of these articles particularly discuss, for example, the question of what is happening in the United Nations and the various draft resolutions and movements in the General Assembly that I have also been discussing. But there is now a growing consensus, or so it seems to me, that there is only a time limit, that there is only a certain amount of time that this military operation can continue, and that trying to extend it beyond that risks mounting international and domestic political opposition, and that Israel, and by extension President Biden, have only a certain amount of time in which for this operation to succeed, and that beyond that, the reality is that some kind of a ceasefire is going to have to be established in order to try to limit the political and diplomatic damage, and that the terms of that ceasefire, if at the time of that ceasefire Hamas is still in existence, is still operating in Gaza, is still the dominant political force and military force in Gaza, that if that happens, then Hamas, despite what happened on 7th October, will be in a position to claim that it is in effect the victor. Anyway, let's start with the first of these articles, and it is in Politico, and it cites comments made by the former Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Barak. Now, Ehud Barak is an interesting person in the context of all of this. He was a former chief of staff of the Israeli military. He is, I believe and understand, one of the most highly decorated soldiers in the entire history of the Israeli military. He has been a former Prime Minister of Israel, and importantly, he was Defense Minister of Israel at the time when the Israeli military last encroached upon Gaza City, during what is known as Operation Cast Lead, which took place some years ago. So, on the face of it, Ehud Barak is a authoritative figure to be talking about these matters. I will introduce some qualifications to this. Ehud Barak, for most of his political life, was associated with the Israeli Labour Party, the party of David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir, which for much of Israel's history was the dominant party in Israel. It has now been reduced to a tiny force. I understand that it only has 4 representatives in the Knesset, from once having been the dominant party in Israel, in Israeli political life. And I understand that Barak himself left that party some time ago. Nonetheless, I presume that overall he is a political opponent of Prime Minister Netanyahu, though the two of them have worked together in the past, and as I said, he was at one time Netanyahu's defense minister. So I presume nonetheless that he is an opponent of Netanyahu, and perhaps it's not surprising also that he might be critical of some of the things that Prime Minister Netanyahu is now doing. And I said that he was Israel's defense minister at the time of Operation Cast Lead. Well, I think there's a widespread view that that didn't go entirely well, and it could be the case that today Ehud Barak doesn't want Netanyahu and the current Israeli government to succeed, where arguably he failed when Operation Cast Lead took place. Now, I make those observations in order to be balanced. I think we always need to understand where someone is coming from. But nonetheless, it's important to stress again that Barak is a Prime Minister of Israel, so he has had experience of international politics and negotiations and of having to deal with Israeli public opinion. He's had past experience of commanding the Israeli military, and he is very familiar both with Hamas and with Gaza, and he knows the difficulties of fighting in Gaza. So overall, I would still say that this is an authoritative and individual. We have to take into account perhaps some of his biases, but that doesn't mean that we should disregard in any way what he actually says. And what does he say? Well, we're getting this now from Politico. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu may be digging in for a long and difficult war, but former leader Ehud Barak fears Israel has only weeks left to eliminate Hamas, as public opinion, most significantly in the United States, rapidly swings against its attacks on Gaza. In an exclusive interview with Politico, the former Prime Minister and Chief of the Israeli Defense Forces also suggested a multinational Arab force could take control of Gaza after the military campaign. And then the report from Politico says, even with that change of the political order in Gaza, Barak stressed the need to return to diplomacy aimed at the creation of a Palestinian state, that was a very remote prospect. And then he said that, Barak said that he had observed that the rhetoric of US officials had shifted in the recent days, with a mounting chorus of calls for a humanitarian pause in the fighting. The sympathy generated towards Israel in the immediate wake of October 7th, when Hamas launched the deadliest terrorist attack on Israel in the Jewish state's 75-year history, was now diminishing. You can see the window is closing. It's clear we are heading towards friction with the Americans about the offensive. America cannot dictate to Israel what to do, but we cannot ignore them. We will have to come to terms with the American demands within the next 2 or 3 weeks, probably less. Well, that's what Barak says. He says that, and he goes on to say that in order to extirpate, in other words, destroy completely Hamas, the main war aim set by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, that would take months or even a year. But again, he noted that Western support was weakening because of the civilian death toll in Gaza and fears of Israel's campaign, sparking a much broader and even more catastrophic war in the region. Listen to the public tone. This is again quotes from Barak, and behind doors it's a little bit more explicit. We are losing public opinion in Europe, and in a week or two we'll start to lose governments in Europe. And after another week, the friction with the Americans will emerge to the surface. And Barak has had plenty, Politico says, Barak has had plenty of experience of dealing with Israel's allies and adversaries in the past. And he said that, well, Israel was right to set its bar high in Gaza, and that there was no real option but for Israel to do what it did. Nonetheless, we see that he nonetheless thinks that the backlash will grow, that in about 2 weeks' time the mood will shift even amongst European governments, and it will shift further in the United States, that the pressure will grow, and he thinks, based on his experience as a Prime Minister of Israel, a Defense Minister, a Chief of Staff, that perhaps Israel has 2 or 3 weeks to complete its operation in Gaza, and he clearly says he doesn't think if the purpose of the operation is to destroy Hamas, which is what we've been told, he clearly doesn't think it can be done. So that is Barak. Now, we've had concerns that time is running out, expressed by an entirely different person, one speaking from the opposite perspective, and that is none other than John Bolton, Donald Trump's former national security advisor, arch neocon, arch hawk, person who always supports wars wherever they happen, and who very much wants to see this military operation that Prime Minister Netanyahu has launched in Gaza. Bolton wants this operation to be persisted with and to continue until it achieves complete success. But he too, Bolton, is now worried that time for Israel, time for the success of this military operation is running out, and he says that the Biden administration is wobbling. And Bolton is writing about all of this in the Daily Telegraph. And the title is Israel is running out of time before Biden damns it to defeat. We should be alarmed. The US's support is rapidly eroding. And he blames it, by the way, he blames a lot of this upon Iran. He says that the Iranians have conducted a masterly information war campaign against Israel. I've seen absolutely no sign of that myself. But anyway, that is classic Bolton. He blames it all on Iran, who obviously is the country that he wants to attack. But anyway, put all that aside, we come back to this. He too is worrying and making it clear that he believes that the time window for this military operation is now closing. And he goes on to say things like this. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's trip this week to Israel, Jordan, and other key players in the region vividly demonstrates the dangerous misconceptions underlying America's Middle East policy. Blinken's visit shows how rapidly Joe Biden's superficially strong support for Israel is eroding. The Israeli Defense Forces are now racing against time before he, that is to say Biden, wilts under domestic and international pressure, and the West's collective enemies exploit his flawed worldview. And then, as I said, he blames it all on Hamas, but he does admit that there have been criticisms, that there have been weaknesses on the part of the Israelis as well. He says, first, before and after the October 7th massacres, Iran, Hamas, and others masterfully deployed their information warfare campaigns, asymmetrically attacking Israel's very legitimacy. Jerusalem was initially unprepared, slow in responding, and still faces inhibitions such as the need to tell the truth that Hamas and its allies don't share. And then Bolton makes some extraordinary claims that Arabs in general aren't particularly bothered about what Israel is doing in Gaza. An incredible claim, by the way. And then he goes on to say, in America and Britain, pro-Palestinian demonstrators jammed the streets, denouncing alleged Israeli war crimes and explaining away or even justifying Hamas's invasion. I don't, by the way, agree with the last point. And then he says, the aim is to exploit Western weakness and lack of resolution. It seems to be working. And he talks then about concerns about the conduct of Israel's military campaign on the part of the opposition Labour Party in Britain and with the Democratic Party in the United States. Then he goes on to say that through strategic failures of imagination and inadequate explanations of the full threat Israel faces from Iran, notice how Bolton always homes in on Iran, Britain and America risk losing the overall diplomatic battle. Blinken's trip was to advocate for a pause in hostilities to allow for more humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. Others are calling for a full ceasefire, and then he goes on to say, Bolton goes on to say, there is no meaningful distinction between these verbal formulations. A former US Senate staffer revealed the game by writing that halting the hostilities that begins with as a temporary measure could be extended, and in other words, that even if you agree a humanitarian pause, the pressure to extend that into an indefinite ceasefire will inevitably increase. And Bolton then makes all sorts of other points which I find both concerning and extraordinary, but all too typical coming from him, about how the fate of the hostages isn't something we should be too focused on, or even Israel should be too focused on. But then he ends, Netanyahu rejected Blinken's démarche, that's for a humanitarian pause, because Israel is literally in hand-to-hand combat against Hamas. But this is only the start of the propaganda campaign. When Biden calls for Israel to pause and sends Blinken to plead his case in Jerusalem, we should be alarmed. Israel has the resolve to continue, but its fate may lie in Washington and London, and that is not good news. So, we see that from a diametrically opposite position, making all kinds of extraordinary claims and assertions, none of which, by the way, I should make clear, I agree with, and with a clear agenda to refocus this whole conflict upon Iran and to seek some kind of reckoning with Iran. But with all of that, Bolton himself, who, whatever he is certainly no one's fool. He also could see the time on this operation is running out, that the international backlash is going, that the Arab states are united in their opposition to it, despite what he says about the fact that Arab opinion is supposedly unconcerned about what is happening, that opinion within the United States and in Europe is shifting, and that this military operation may only have a limited amount of time before a stop is imposed upon it. And he understands clearly that were that to happen, that would be for Israel, specifically for Prime Minister Netanyahu, and ultimately for the West as well, a political and diplomatic defeat. Now that's Bolton, as I said, looking at this from an entirely different perspective than Ehud Barak that I discussed before. But both of them can see that the situation is not turning out well. The time is starting to run out. However, in some ways, the most measured article, I say measured, the magazine where I have read this in, The Economist, is not one which I would normally say writes measured articles. But anyway, the more measured article, the more measured discussion of all of this, and the more comprehensive one, is in The Economist. And it essentially says the same thing. Title, once more. Well, the first title, Israel's Window of Legitimacy. Will America pull the plug on Israel's invasion of Gaza? Question mark. Israel is racing to destroy Hamas as global backlash grows. And then the article in The Economist goes on to say this. It was hardly a warm welcome, although that no doubt came as little surprise to Tony Blinken, America's Secretary of State, as he spent the past few days shuttling across the Middle East. His second trip since the start of the Gaza war on October 7th. In Amman, his Jordanian counterpart, Ayman Safadi, told Mr. Blinken to stop the madness. The language Blinken heard in private across the region was even tougher. His meeting with Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, lasted less than an hour and ended with no joint statement. Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey did not bother to meet him at all. Mr. Blinken's chilly reception was one side of mounting anger at Israel's war in Gaza. Now in its second month, it has killed more than 10,000 Palestinians and damaged or destroyed more than 11% of the buildings in the enclave. It has enraged the Arab world, inflamed Western capitals, and drawn condemnation from many Western world leaders. Israeli generals still talk about waging a long campaign that will last up to a year. On November 7th, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told ABC News that Israel would be in charge of Gaza's security for an indefinite period. In practice, though, what Israeli officers call their window of legitimacy is probably far shorter. How far that window closes will depend largely on America. If Joe Biden wants the war to end, Israel will be hard-pressed to ignore him. And then The Economist says that so far Biden is still supporting Israel, but he now supports humanitarian pauses to allow more aid to enter Gaza. He has rejected calls for an outright ceasefire, but administration officials have made clear in a series of leaks that they doubt Israel has a coherent exit strategy in Gaza. They complain that Mr. Netanyahu is barely willing to discuss the topic and say they want to put their concerns on the record now, lest the war ends badly. They want to put their concerns on the record now, lest the war ends badly. Why did they allow the war to happen at all if that was a concern they have? And we go on to read, and this is in The Economist, to think a war risks becoming a quagmire, but to support it nonetheless is an untenable position, especially when American voters agree. And then we have lots of commentaries about opinion polls and the mood in the Middle East and that sort of thing. Well, here we are. There's much more, as I said, to say. The Economist also talks about the economic costs for Israel of the war. All things that, as I said, we've been discussing on the Duran on this channel for many weeks now, and it's now all there. So, put it all together. What are all of these articles telling us? And they're not the only ones. There's been articles about this in National Review, in other places in the media, but these are perhaps in some ways the most interesting and authoritative. That Israel has only a limited time window to defeat Hamas. Well, I've been saying that all along. That defeating Hamas in Gaza City might be extremely difficult to do within the necessary time window. That Israel doesn't have months or a year in which to complete this operation. We see the Economist confirm exactly what I've been saying, that Secretary of State Blinken's recent tour of the Middle East, his diplomacy there has been an abject failure, a complete disaster. He's had the doors slammed in his face wherever he goes. He's not speaking to the Arab leaders in terms that they are interested in listening to. And by the way, the administration, someone in the administration, possibly President Biden himself, more plausibly Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, are now doing that which the administration regularly does. Whenever Blinken goes somewhere and makes a mess, they send the one real professional in the administration, William Burns, the CIA director, to clean up the mess Blinken has left behind him. So Burns is now also on some kind of a tour in the Middle East. He's just gone to Israel. I believe he's going to Egypt. He's probably going to be visiting other places. Make no mistake about it, he's there to repair the damage. The Economist itself is now confirming the accuracy of all the things that, again, we've been saying on the Duran in our various programs about the mess that Blinken and, by the way, the President himself have made of their diplomacy in the Middle East, both in Israel and in the Arab states. So the one professional in the room, the one person who knows his job, the one person who served as a professional diplomat in the past, the person who was once an ambassador to Moscow, William Burns, as I said, is now being sent to try to put the pieces back together. Anyway, how did we get here? How did we find ourselves in this situation where Israel launched a war which some people, we are now authoritatively being told in Washington, risks becoming a quagmire? That's the word the Economist is using. I've never used it, but they have it in the Economist, a quagmire, a war in which civilians have been killed in their thousands, the Economist says, tens of thousands, a war in which children are being killed, and where the pictures of these children being killed are being publicized around the world, where hospitals are being attacked, the Israelis say, as a necessary part of their military campaign. But of course the optics of this, the politics behind this, are disastrous, where ambulance convoys are being attacked. Again, they say that Hamas leaders were hiding in these convoys. May be true, but again, the politics of that, the optics of that are, again, disastrous. Anyway, how did we get here? How did this all happen? Well, the first thing to say is that all of this was completely conceivable. We've been saying this, as I said, on the Duran. I've been saying all of this would happen on this channel. And now we see that we are there. And to be very clear, the primary fault for what is now clearly shaping into a potential debacle, a very likely debacle. We see Ehud Barak worrying about this in Israel. We see John Bolton worrying about this in the United States. We see the Economist worrying about this in Britain. The ultimate reason why we are facing this situation is because the one person who could and should have insisted on a more measured approach, a more appropriate approach to what happened on 7th October. The President of the United States, Joe Biden, the individual who has more leverage over the actions of the Israeli government than any other person on earth, Joe Biden, instead of doing that, went to Israel, gave in public Prime Minister Netanyahu a blank check, knowing fully well the enormous political pressures that Prime Minister Netanyahu is within Israel itself and the likely actions that Prime Minister Netanyahu would take, and wasted perhaps 2 weeks of time trying to get the Arab states to agree to something that there was never any possibility that they would agree to, which is the decanting of the entire population of Gaza into Egypt. At this critical point, the President of the United States, President Biden, miscalculated disastrously. Israel is paying the price. The United States is also paying the price. And as to who the ultimate winners will be, well, Hamas, politically, though perhaps not militarily, might quite plausibly be one. But anyway, Bolton is focusing increasingly about the Iran-Russia axis, how they are sitting to reap the political benefits of the mistakes that have been made, even though in Bolton's case he doesn't recognise those mistakes. He doesn't think that President Biden went far enough. So there we go. All predictable, all exactly as things are shaping out. We can see the political and diplomatic pressures growing. We see Burns being sent to the Middle East to try to rebuild bridges there. We see the alarm about President Biden's prospects in a runoff against Donald Trump. There's been a whole series of articles about this. The Economist, alongside this article that I've just been quoting from, talks about the terrifying prospect of Donald Trump's return to the White House, and how this is now looking fully plausible. There's an equally alarmed and panicked article about this very same topic in the Financial Times by Gideon Rachman. They're all worrying that as a result of this debacle, and by the way, the debacle that is now shaping in Ukraine, President Biden is going to be holed under the waterline, politically speaking, that his chances of success in the presidential elections next year are slipping away. And as we saw, as I discussed yesterday, we now have comments from people like David Axelrod, who are stating quite openly that President Biden needs to abandon the idea of seeking re-election. And I discussed again in my program yesterday how if President Biden does decide not to seek re-election, then there's a real possibility that demands for him to step down, including from within the Democratic Party itself, will grow. By the way, today the Financial Times is leading with what it says were successful votes for the Democrats in various regional elections in various states. I'm not an expert on American politics, certainly not local politics. I doubt that these have any national significance. But if they do, then actually, I think in a kind of a way, they're probably bad news for Joe Biden rather than good news. They might lead many Democrats to think that they can actually continue winning, and provided the one factor that is pulling them down, Joe Biden, is removed from the scene. And that might cause Democrats to say to each other, the quicker we can get rid of Joe Biden, so that we can actually have some real prospect of holding on to Congress and perhaps the White House next year, the better it will be for us. Just so. Anyway, there we are. That is where we are. Now, again, I am focusing today on the politics of this conflict. I've not discussed so far the military aspects. I will turn to those briefly. There's been a long article in the Financial Times discussing the military aspects of this war. And one of the things that I immediately noticed in this long article, the military briefing, the battle for Gaza City, the first thing that I noticed, the first thing that stood out for me from this long article in the Financial Times was this paragraph. Israel's aim, military officials and analysts say, will not be to fight street by street as US-led forces did in Fallujah during the Second Iraq War. Instead, its plan is to clear out pockets of territory and use them as bases for urban raids. The result will be a series of small battles and skirmishes for sections of the territory. Now, that is exactly, and I want to say this, that is exactly what this extremely well-informed person who has a background in military affairs and who has been writing to me regularly discussing military developments. Not just, by the way, in this conflict, but in other conflicts too, including the one in Ukraine. That is exactly what he said to me the Israeli strategy would be. They would not try to storm through Gaza all in one go. They would try to break up the territory into pockets, and they would try to clear them methodically and systematically, one by one. So I just wanted to say that, and if this person is listening to the program, I just wanted him to know this, that the Financial Times, which is speaking to people, military officials and analysts, people who presumably know the Israeli plans, well, he's just completely corroborated all the things that he's been saying. Anyway, let's put that aside. The article, this article in the Financial Times, is, I'm going to say, even about the prospects of this. It's not saying one way or the other how effective this military strategy will be. Now, again, I want to stress, when people are talking about the effectiveness of a military strategy, nobody is saying that if Israel were given an indefinite amount of time, this strategy would not succeed. The point is not whether it can succeed if Israel has a year or 2 years or 10 to see this thing through. The point is Israel doesn't have that amount of time. We've seen articles in Politico, an interview with Ehud Barak. We've seen an article by John Bolton. We've seen, as I said, an even more authoritative article from The Economist, all telling us the same thing, that in fact time is short. This operation doesn't have indefinite time for it to be successful. Anyway, the Financial Times article says that communication blackouts make it hard to assess the IDF's progress, and it then goes on to say that Israel has shifted its focus away from targeting high-ranking Hamas planners behind October 7th to include mid-level field lieutenants leading the fight against Israeli troops. This would significantly undermine Hamas's capabilities to carry out counterattacks, said a spokesman. Complex operations lie ahead. The Israeli military has already indicated it plans to take control of Al-Shifa Hospital, the largest in the Strip, in the heart of Gaza City. Israel says Hamas has built a vast underground headquarters beneath the medical facility. Taking over Shifa would also be symbolic. And then we see the caveats. To take control of a site such as Shifa, you have to become a static force from a moving force, said an Israeli soldier with experience in the field. Infantry will be required to leave the armoured vehicles and maintain roadblocks whilst protecting themselves from Hamas. The Financial Times then says that dozens of buildings around Shifa have already been destroyed by airstrikes. Many people have pointed out that this creates rubble, which Hamas might itself be able to use. Then the article goes on to say that Hamas itself denies that Shifa is being used for military purposes. And can I stress again, I don't know what the truth is. I am sceptical that the bunker complex beneath Shifa, if it even exists, is anything like as sophisticated or as elaborate as Israel says. But again, what do I know? And then we also go on to read that Israel forces have also been able to move armour right across the Strip, roughly along the newly built number 10 road to the Mediterranean Sea. But it might be more difficult from this point onwards as Israel advances into the built-up areas. If troops move in, they would be easy targets. Again, I'm reading partly from the Financial Times article. While images of them amongst dense crowds of refugees would provide rich imagery for Hamas to broadcast through the Arab world. And it goes on to say that advancing Israeli forces have claimed that Hamas is using civilians as a shield, but then that is the nature of insurgency war. And we also go on to read that there are weaknesses in Israeli armour. Israel's sophisticated armour has its limits. New windowless 8-ton armoured personnel carriers are in short supply. Older Namer infantry fighting vehicles are being used. Last week, one was pierced by back-to-back anti-tank missiles fired by a Hamas crew, killing all 10 Israeli soldiers inside. And we're told that the intensity of the fighting has escalated, and overall it does seem as if there are problems. Just as Gaza is not impregnable, I don't have a single person who says that Gaza is impregnable, by the way, but just as Gaza is not impregnable, neither, this is from the Financial Times, is the IDF's cutting-edge technology. Hamas released a video last week of a drone dropping what appeared to be a grenade on a group of Israeli soldiers sitting in a circle. In the last frame, at least half a dozen soldiers lie prone on the ground, casualties of an enemy determined to exploit any crack in Israel's armour. And that is how the article ends. So a tough, grueling battle, at least that's the overall sense that I get from the Financial Times article. One which the Financial Times appears to believe will take a long time, and as all of those other articles which I talked about before, the Politico article, the interview with Ehud Barak, the John Bolton article in the Daily Telegraph, the Economist article that I've also read from, they all agree the time actually is short, the backlash is increasing, the politics of this, the diplomacy of this is terrible, and Blinken's tour of the Middle East was a disaster. And of course, as I've said, William Burns has had to be sent to clean up the mess. Well, as I've said so many times, the best thing to do when one is in a hole is to stop digging. I understand that US officials are now increasingly, urgently talking to the Israelis about some kind of humanitarian pause. Just before I started making this program, I saw that there'd been a news flash which said that the administration does not expect Israel to occupy Gaza indefinitely. What appears to be a response to Prime Minister Netanyahu's statement yesterday that Israel does intend to maintain some kind of indefinite security control over Gaza. So perhaps we are indeed starting to see a shift in US policy. Perhaps the US is indeed starting to edge, exactly as Barak, Bolton, and the Economist say, towards agreeing a ceasefire. But let me stress again, coming after all that has happened, coming after a month in which political and diplomatic capital has been wasted, squandered, thrown away, that would only limit a failure which is already there. And there is, of course, always the risk, as the Economist, as Ehud Barak, all admit, there's always a risk that there might be a further escalation. Going back to Bolton, note again how throughout his article he hammers away about Iran. He even talks preposterously about a Russia-Iran axis, which he implies is pulling all the strings behind all that is going on in the Middle East, and which obviously he wants to see broken. Rather than see a diplomatic debacle, which is what we're increasingly looking at, people like Bolton are going to be agitating increasingly for some kind of escalation instead. And there has been one very concerning military development on the part of the United States. Now, I have discussed in many programs the vast armada that the United States has deployed to the Middle East. The 2 aircraft carriers, the 11 Aegis destroyers. Apparently there's Aegis cruisers as well. There's also nuclear submarines operating. yesterday I saw perhaps the most alarming development of all, which is reports and pictures of an Ohio-class submarine, nuclear submarine, transferring through the Suez Canal into the Red Sea. Now, this is not a strategic missile submarine. Ohio-class submarines were designed to launch intercontinental sea-launched ballistic missiles against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And most of them still carry Trident II intercontinental missiles, which form a key part of America's strategic nuclear deterrent. But 4 of these submarines have been converted to a tactical use. Instead of launching strategic nuclear missiles, they're able to launch dozens, scores, perhaps hundreds of Tomahawk cruise missiles at a target. This would be a huge wave of cruise missiles. And they're also, by the way, able to operate parties of Navy SEALs on sabotage missions. This is an offensive tactical system, exactly the kind of system that you would want to deploy in place if your plan was to launch some kind of military strike against Iran. Now, the decision to deploy this submarine must have been taken some weeks ago. It will have taken some weeks for this particular submarine to reach the Mediterranean, to transit through the Suez Canal, to enter the Red Sea, to deploy presumably off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula within range of its targets in Iran. So presumably the decision to send it to this region was made in the early days of this particular conflict, when the United States was trying to persuade Arab states to agree to decant people from Gaza into Sinai, and seemed to be working towards some kind of military strike on Iran. But those deployments, authorized at that time, have never been cancelled. They are still, obviously, working their way through. And that means that people like Bolton and his friends and supporters in the administration, and they do exist, who hanker for a strike against Iran, now have all the tools in place. Another powerful tool in the form of this particular submarine. And there it is, in place exactly for that kind of strike. And we can see how over the next few days, rather than risk that diplomatic debacle, next few days and weeks, rather than risk that diplomatic debacle, you can see how all the usual suspects in the United States, in the administration, in the media, in the various permanent agencies of the United States government will now be pressing and agitating and pushing for all of these assets to be used for that strike that they have always hankered against the head of the octopus supposedly behind all of Israel's and America's problems in the Middle East, the place where the octopus that was ultimately behind the attack on the 7th of October. They will agitate for that strike against Iran. The mere presence of huge military forces in a particular region, those forces primed to take action, is inevitably going to give rise to temptations which, let's hope this time, will be resisted, but which perhaps it might have been better, given the way in which the diplomatic pieces are falling, which it might be better if those temptations had never been placed in their way. Anyway, let me now move on to the next crisis, the crisis in Ukraine. And briefly, can I say that as I've been making this program, there's been lots more news of military developments on various parts of the battlefronts. And the most dramatic actually seems to be in the Bakhmut area. It's clear that the Russians have now made significant advances north of Bakhmut in the area of the Berkhovka reservoir. They've managed to recapture all of the ground that they appear to have lost since Ukraine began its counteroffensive around Bakhmut, which, by the way, was in May, before Ukraine launched its counteroffensive in other places. But interestingly and importantly, the Russians now also seem to be attacking south of Bakhmut as well. There's reports that Russian troops are now pushing through Klishevka, a village which Ukraine claimed to have captured. That's been long disputed by the Russians. They've always said that Klishevka was in the grey zone. Anyway, it seems that Russian troops have now entered Klishevka and that they're pushing westward, that they're pushing in the Andreevka area, further south from Klishevka, that there seems to be a general Russian advance taking place around Bakhmut, something on a bigger scale than we have seen in earlier battles in this bitterly fought and bitterly contested region, the area where, in some respects, the fighting has been most intense of all through the summer and autumn, even as the attention has been focused more on the Zaporozhye front. So the Russians pushing hard there, pushing hard also apparently near Avdiivka. More reports of the Russians now apparently attacking. Some reports even claim that they've even entered the territory of the Avdiivka coke factory, this big factory to the northwest of Avdiivka, which controls the access roads to the town, and of more Russian advances west of the railway, somewhere further to the northwest, with Russians apparently, supposedly, now encroaching upon the village of Stepnoye on their way further west towards Berdichi. Again, if the Russians are able to capture all of these places, then the trap which Avdiivka would then have become for the Ukrainian soldiers who are there, the trap will have been closed shut. So major events apparently taking place in those places, and also a big Russian advance in the Kupiansk area. More reports of the Russians steadily breaking down Ukrainian defenses around Kupiansk, and also reports of the Russians making significant progress around Liman, the town that the Russians captured in May 2022, that the Ukrainians were then able to recapture at the beginning of October 2022, which has remained under Ukrainian control since then, but which the Russians also now seem to be again approaching. And I see in a report, I think it was written by Boris Rozhin, important Russian commentator, who writes under the persona of Colonel Kasad. Boris Rozhin seems to be talking about big weaknesses on part of the Ukrainian command around Liman. The only area, as I've said previously, where Ukraine does still seem to have the initiative is along the Dnieper River in Kherson region. Ukrainian troops still seem to be present in Krinky. The Russians controlled the west of Krinky, this small village on the banks of the Dnieper River, but they've not managed to dislodge the Ukrainian forces there. And there are some reports that the Ukrainians not only are reinforcing in Krinky, but they've even managed to move apparently some armoured vehicles across the Dnieper into this village. However, the overall sense I still get, and this is consistent with some reports, some comments that I've been receiving again, which of course I can't discuss in huge amounts of detail, but the comments I've received again and some of the open sources suggest that Ukrainian forces in this area are not in any condition to mount any large-scale offensive. They're simply not numerous enough. And they also say that Russian defense lines, the big Russian defense lines, here as in other places, are not on the banks of the Dnieper, where they would be exposed to artillery strikes from the Ukrainian forces. On the west bank of the Dnieper and in the islands, the west bank of the Dnieper is higher, has higher elevations than the east bank, where the Russians are located. That the big Russian fortifications, the minefields, the trenches, the pillboxes, all of that are somewhere to the east, and that the Ukrainians have never reached them and are most unlikely to. There are still suggestions that the Russians anyway do intend to launch a counterattack in this area. And there was even one report I've seen which suggested that the Russians now are countering Ukrainian attempts to cross the Dnieper onto the east bank by sending reconnaissance and scout parties and raiding parties onto the Ukrainian-controlled West Bank, so that the Russians now are also regularly present on the West Bank. And there was even a report that some Russian troops, working together with artillery and air force units, had managed to defeat a large Ukrainian concentration of troops on the West Bank of the Dnieper. Obviously, the information is rather difficult to decipher. My immediate response to what is happening here is that the numbers of men on each side seem to be relatively small. We're talking about groups in the hundreds. Armoured vehicles don't seem to be in use much by either side. Of course, crossing the Dnieper with armoured vehicles is incredibly difficult. I get the sense that the Russians feel that they have the situation overall under control. The new commander, General Teplinsky, is no doubt busy deciding what to do. And of course, General Zaluzhny, the overall commander of the Ukrainian military, said to The Economist a few days ago that no one should expect a breakthrough anywhere on the front lines, and a Ukrainian breakthrough anywhere on the front lines. And obviously he was including the fighting along the Dnieper River as well. And I expect that just like every other attack that Ukraine has launched since its offensive began on the 4th of June, this one eventually will also burn itself out. I ought to say that there's also reports that in Kherson region on the Dnieper, the Ukrainians again are suffering very heavy losses as a result of artillery and airstrikes, and that wouldn't surprise me at all if it were indeed the case. And if so, one wonders whether this whole operation makes any kind of military sense anyway. But that's a discussion for another day. The big story in Ukraine, or so it seems to me, continues to be the deepening political crisis between President Zelensky, the political leadership, and General Zaluzhny, the military leadership, and the military altogether. It is starting to look increasingly as if the relationship between Zelensky and not just Zaluzhny, but the entire military leadership of the Ukrainian military is starting to break down. And we had that bizarre incident yesterday of the strange death of Major Chastyakov on the occasion of his birthday, after he received that gift of a whiskey decanter and what appeared to have been a set of either shot glasses, which was the story I was hearing yesterday, or of grenades, one of which blew up when he pulled off the pin and which killed him. Now, the official Ukrainian line continues to be that this was all a tragic mistake, that this was a gift that was sent to Major Chastyakov by apparently by a military official who is attached in some way to Zelensky's team. Anyway, that this gift was received. Apparently, Major Chastyakov was told in advance that the grenades were in fact live, but somehow or other he made the mistake of pulling the pin, and that caused the explosion in which he was killed. Now, I have to say, I find that as an explanation a very strange one. I find the whole idea of sending, apparently through the post or by courier, I don't know how, a gift of live grenades to someone on their birthday, a very strange one as well. And of course, there's lots of speculations and rumours now swirling in Ukraine about this entire incident. But following on from what I said in my previous programme, I think that most people in Ukraine, most people who have heard about this incident and who have any knowledge of the details, most of them will still believe that it was some kind of assassination. And there's all sorts of rumours and allegations swirling around about who was behind this whole affair, if it was an assassination, who might have been behind it, and all kinds of fingers are pointing. I want to make it very clear straight away that I don't know the truth, and I presume that there will be a police investigation, and that police investigation, maybe we should wait and see what it tells us, and even if I decide that some kind of whitewash or cover-up is taking place, well, it may be that once we have the police reports, they will still provide us with enough information to glean further clues about the nature of what has happened. But anyway, for the record, given that we have had this interview that General Zaluzhny gave to The Economist, in which he effectively admitted that Ukraine is losing the war, and which he gave apparently without any authorization from the civilian leadership, given that we previously had another article from Time magazine about which confirmed that President Zelensky is looking to sack a senior general in order to fasten upon him the responsibility for the failure of the offensive, a senior general who can only realistically be Zaluzhny himself, given that we've also received reports of President Zelensky dismissing, without informing General Zaluzhny, senior generals, specifically the general in charge of Ukraine's special forces. It seems to me that it beggars belief, let's put it like this, that this violent death of one of Zaluzhny's most senior assistants, some are saying that he was even Zaluzhny's chief of staff, is somehow unconnected to these events. And in fact, in the hours after that incident took place, this strange killing took place, rumours were swirling about Zaluzhny's resignation or about Zaluzhny's dismissal. There were reports that the new Ukrainian defense minister, Rustem Umanov, had written a letter to President Zelensky demanding General Zaluzhny's dismissal. There were also reports that General Zaluzhny himself had resigned. Shortly after that, there were statements from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, including from Defense Minister Umarov himself, flatly contradicting those claims. As of now, General Zaluzhny remains in place, but clearly there are tensions, and there are all sorts of reports circulating as well that the killing of Major Chastyakov was intended as some kind of warning to General Zaluzhny. There's been suggestions that, in effect, he's been told that if he involves himself in politics, if he resigns, if he leads some kind of open challenge to President Zelensky and his government, well, then people will be coming after him. Now, I don't know the truth behind all of these rumours. All sorts of things, no doubt, are taking place, and we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that perhaps the mere fact that there are tensions inside a government, that these necessarily are going to lead to a collapse of that government. There's been talk about a coup, a night of the long knives, all those sort of things. I'm not myself convinced that we are necessarily heading to that point. Bear in mind that we've also had intrigues which have affected the Russian government also. A couple of weeks ago, a military unit, the Wagner organization, parts of it at least, mutinied at the instigation of its nominal leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin. There was a march on Moscow. The march was then called off, and then 2 months later, in again unexplained circumstances, the leader of that march, that mutiny, Prigozhin himself, was killed in an air crash, which has also resulted in lots of unanswered questions. But of course, President Putin remains in full control of the government. His position looks firmly secure, and as we also know, at the moment, as of tomorrow, he's traveling to Kazakhstan, where he expects to have detailed discussions with the president of that country, President Tokayev. So, a crisis of some kind in Russia was successfully overcome, and, well, there's always a possibility that President Zelensky will be able to contain whatever the political and other fallout from this affair this affair with Zaluzhny is. I am going to suggest, though, that we shouldn't push those comparisons between the Prigozhin affair and this latest affair too far. Firstly, Putin was not only in secure control of the government when Prigozhin launched his mutiny, but of course the Russians at that point were already succeeding in countering and defeating the Ukrainian offensive. So morale in Russia at that time was strong, and it also appeared as if the general population firmly supported President Putin. His opinion poll ratings were solid. And of course, Prigozhin himself was not a military officer, whereas General Zaluzhny is the military leader. He's a general, but he's the military leader of the entire Ukrainian armed forces. So the position of the two people is different. The military during the Prigozhin crisis strongly supported President Putin. This time, on the contrary, it seems that the military is much more skeptical of President Zelensky, and that they're becoming increasingly critical of him. And the reason they're becoming critical of him is because whereas at the time of the Prigozhin affair, it was already looking as if the Russians would defeat Ukraine's counteroffensive and would go on to win the war. Well, on this occasion, over the course of the current crisis, it must look to the military as if Ukraine is losing the war. So this crisis has greater possibilities of spiraling out of control. Now, there's not been any clear resolution to this crisis at the moment. Zaluzhny has not been sacked. He remains in place. At the same time, President Zelensky also remains in place. And it could be that neither man is in a position to act against the other. President Zelensky would be a difficult person to overthrow, if that's what General Zaluzhny and his military commanders are thinking, because, well, first of all, he is the constitutional president. Even if he is the constitutional president who has just announced that there's not going to be any elections in Ukraine, but he's also the constitutional president who still has the public support of the West. He's just had a meeting with Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission. She's recently been to Kiev, and she's met Zelensky there. And the European Union has now published a report discussing Ukraine's process towards eventual European Union membership, and recommending that Ukraine and Moldova should begin negotiations to start to get that accession process started. Well, of course, whilst Ukraine is at war, there is no possibility of it joining the European Union. But at the very least, the fact that there is even talk about eventual accession to the European Union is a sign that the European Union, the West, still backs, at least in some form, Zelensky. And of course, if there was some kind of constitutional crisis in Kiev, and even more if there was an unconstitutional crisis in Kiev, in other words, a coup, well, obviously all those accession proceedings would have to be binned, because there is no conceivable way that the European Union could grant membership, even in theory, to a country which is in the process, which is where governments are overthrown through coups. So Zelensky has the public support of the West, and it does seem as if Zaluzhny, for his part, has the public support, or at least has the implicit support, of the other senior military commanders. And how then does one resolve this problem? Well, of course, in theory, Zelensky can sack all the military commanders, but then the question becomes, whom is he going to put in their place? And if Zelensky goes along the path of sacking senior military commanders en masse, then there is a risk that the military will become disorganized and demoralized in advance of what many are saying will be a major Russian offensive over the course of the winter. And by the way, on that front, there's also apparently been more Russian missile and drone strikes across Ukraine over the last couple of hours. There were heavy strikes in all sorts of cities, including in particular Zaporozhye and Dnipro. And there's reports now that the Russians are starting to edge closer towards targeting Ukraine's energy system. We'll see whether that happens. But anyway, given the military crisis, a clear out of your entire military leadership doesn't seem to be a particularly good idea. But of course, if you leave them all in place, if you leave General Zaluzhny in place, then what you have is a situation where trust and confidence between the political leader, President Zelensky, and the military leader, General Zaluzhny, of a country at war, which is Ukraine, has completely and comprehensively broken down. In some ways, for Ukraine, that might be the very worst outcome of all. Prolonging the war against a backdrop of a continuing political crisis in Kiev itself, which is incapable of resolution. I cannot imagine, in fact, a more stressful and difficult outcome for a nation at war. But that, conceivably, is what we might see. Anyway, the rumours are that President Zelensky, for the moment at least, is digging in. He's insisting on continuing this offensive, even though in every place, apart from the Dnieper in Kherson region, the reality is that there is not only no offensive, but that the Ukrainians are actually retreating, and we're looking at a major crisis, possibly in Avdiivka, or probably in Avdiivka, possibly in Kupiansk and Bakhmut as well. But President Zelensky wants to keep the offensive going. He insists that every millimetre of territory must be defended as well. And there's also reports that he now intends to embark on a whole new pattern of mobilization. And he apparently is coming close to the point where he intends to start conscripting university students. The one large, young male part of the Ukrainian population, which has so far been exempt from the call-up, but of course which he apparently has decided has to be called up also. So, just to say, that would be a disastrous outcome. It might be a politically dangerous one as well. Students, after all, are people who famously protest. The draft riots in the United States in the 1960s were often driven by people from within the student community and by young people who did not want to be drafted and sent off, risking their lives in Vietnam. But anyway, that, it seems, is what President Zelensky intends to do. Meanwhile, Ukraine runs out of money. He's apparently telling the United States that if the United States cannot simply give money to Ukraine, then it should loan money to Ukraine, which Ukraine would repay after the war. How Ukraine would do that remains unclear. The Ukrainian government itself says that it has a $30 billion hole in its budget for next year. It's not at all clear how that hole is going to be filled. The war goes on. The crisis continues. It is both military and political. The West is focusing increasingly on the Middle East. Support for Ukraine in the United States continues to fall. There is deadlock in Congress about providing Ukraine with further aid. And in the meantime, there is a festering political crisis in Kiev, a conflict between the civilian and military leadership, with some reason to think that the opponents, the two sides, one side at least, is now taking action to kill some people on the other side, perhaps in order to give warnings. One way or the other, the outlook not only is not good, it is terrible indeed. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. Just to say, briefly coming back to Ukraine, that of course in an atmosphere of political crisis, the idea of any kind of negotiation being proposed to the Russians is hardly plausible. Negotiations in this kind of situation require a united government, and it's becoming increasingly clear that that is not what Ukraine has. But anyway, there we are. This is where I end today's video. Just to remind you once more, you can find all our programs on X, on Locals, and on Rumble, as well as, of course, YouTube. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, and please also remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.